My name is Margaret Johnson. I am 117 years old. Most people look at me and ask one question: how are you still here? They expect me to talk about diet or vitamins or some secret food I ate every day. But if I am honest with you, longevity is not just about staying alive. It is about staying mentally strong when everything around you changes. When I was a little girl, life was simple but hard. We didn't have much money. I remember winters when the house was colder than it should have been. I remember my mother sewing clothes by hand. There was no talk of emotions back then. You worked, you endured, you moved forward. But even as a child, I felt things deeply. I worried easily. I would lie awake at night thinking about things that hadn't even happened yet. Nobody called it anxiety. They called it imagination, but it felt heavy. As I grew older, I learned to carry that heaviness quietly. I married young. My husband was kind, steady, and patient. We built a life together during difficult times. We survived economic struggles. We survived uncertainty. There were days we didn't know how we would manage, but somehow we always did. But life is not kind forever. When I was 38, I lost my father. That was the first time I truly understood grief. It felt like someone had removed the ground beneath my feet, and yet I still had children to raise. I still had responsibilities. So I swallowed my tears and continued. That became a pattern in my life. Feel deeply, but keep moving. Years passed. Children grew up. The world changed. But the hardest moment of my life came when I lost my husband. After nearly 50 years together, I woke up one morning and he was gone. The silence in the house was louder than any storm I had ever heard. People visited for a few weeks. They brought food. They said kind words. Then slowly they returned to their own lives, and I was left alone in a house filled with memories. I will tell you something honest. There were nights I did not want to wake up the next morning, not because I wanted to die, but because I did not know how to continue. That is something people do not talk about when they discuss longevity. Living long means watching many goodbyes. It means carrying memories that sometimes feel heavier than your body. But here is what kept me alive. I refused to let grief become my entire identity. I allowed myself to cry. I allowed myself to miss him. But I also forced myself to keep small routines. I made my bed. I watered my plants. I walked to the mailbox even when I didn't feel like it. Those tiny actions saved me. At 90, people started calling me strong. But strength was never loud. It was quiet. It was waking up and choosing to keep going when nothing felt exciting anymore. At 100, I felt invisible sometimes. The world moved faster. Conversations changed. Technology confused me. I felt like a stranger in a time that no longer belonged to me. That can disturb the mind deeply, feeling left behind. But instead of fighting the new world, I became curious about it. I asked questions. I learned slowly. I accepted that I didn't need to understand everything to still belong here. Now at 117, I wake up every morning with one thought. I am still here for a reason. My body is weaker. My steps are slower. My hands tremble slightly, but my mind is clear because I stopped resisting life. The secret to living this long is not avoiding pain. It is learning how to carry it without letting it crush you. I forgave people. I forgave myself. I stopped replaying old arguments in my head. I stopped punishing myself for mistakes made decades ago. If you want to live long emotionally, not just physically, you must let go of bitterness. Bitterness ages you faster than time ever will. At 117, I have learned this. You cannot control how long you live, but you can control how tightly you hold on to anger, regret, and fear. And if you loosen your grip, even a heavy life becomes lighter. I am not here because I was fearless. I am here because I kept choosing to wake up. One more day, one more breath, one more chance. And sometimes that is enough. When I look back at my life, there is one period that tested me more than any other. My 40s and 50s. People think long life means peaceful years stacked neatly together. It does not. There were years when I felt like I was barely surviving. The world was unstable. There was fear in the air. War changed families. News arrived slowly. Back then, but when it arrived, it carried weight. I remember nights sitting by the radio, holding my breath, listening for updates. Even when my own home was safe, my heart was not. Living through uncertain times changes the way your mind works. You begin to expect bad news. You prepare yourself emotionally before anything even happens. That kind of constant tension stays in your body. I did not realize it at the time, but I was living in a state of quiet anxiety. My children were growing. My husband worked long hours. I tried to be strong for everyone. I cooked, cleaned, managed the house, and smiled when needed. But inside, I was tired, not physically, emotionally. There were mornings I woke up with a heaviness I could not explain. Nothing was wrong, but everything felt fragile. I would look at my family at the breakfast table and feel a sudden fear of losing them. That fear would stay with me all day. Nobody talked about mental health back then. If you felt overwhelmed, you called it stress, and you continued. I continued. Then life tested me in a way I was not prepared for. One of my children became seriously ill. Hospitals became part of our routine. I learned how to sit for hours in waiting rooms that smelled of antiseptic and worry. I learned how to smile at my child while feeling terrified inside. There is a particular kind of helplessness that comes when you cannot protect your child from pain. Those months aged me more than the previous decade. At night, when everyone else slept, I would sit alone in the kitchen. I would stare at the wall and ask myself how much more I could carry. I was not angry at God. I was not angry at the world. I was simply exhausted. Eventually, my child recovered, but something in me had changed. I realized that strength is not endless. Even the strongest person has limits. In my early 50s, I experienced what I now understand was emotional burnout. I stopped enjoying things. I avoided social gatherings. I felt disconnected even in crowded rooms. I smiled out of habit, not joy. My husband noticed before I did. One evening he said, "Margaret, you look like you're somewhere else." He was right. I was somewhere else, trapped in my own thoughts. That conversation forced me to admit something I had never admitted before. I was not okay. Saying those words out loud felt strange, almost shameful, but also relieving. I did not go to therapy. That was rare in those days. But I began doing something small and powerful. I started writing. Every night I wrote down what I felt, not what I thought I should feel, but what was actually inside me. Fear, exhaustion, anger, gratitude, love. Writing became my quiet therapy. it taught me something important. Feelings lose their power when you face them directly. Around that same time, I started walking alone every morning, just 10 or 15 minutes. No destination, just movement. I began noticing simple things: birds, sunlight, wind, small reminders that life continues even when your mind feels stuck. That routine slowly brought me back. By my late 50s, I felt stronger, not because life became easier, but because I understood my mind better. I stopped pretending I was unbreakable. I accepted that long life requires emotional maintenance. People see someone who is 117 years old and assume resilience came naturally. It did not. It was built during years when I felt weak. Those difficult decades taught me something that carried me through the rest of my life. Pain is temporary, but avoidance makes it permanent. When you avoid grief, it grows. When you avoid fear, it multiplies. But when you sit with it, breathe through it, and allow it space, it softens. I'm still here today because I stopped running from my emotions in my 50s. I learned to live with uncertainty. I learned to survive exhaustion. I learned to speak honestly when I was overwhelmed. Those lessons became my foundation, and without that foundation, I would never have made it to 117. When I entered my 60s, I believed I had already survived the hardest parts of life. I had endured uncertainty, illness, emotional exhaustion, and fear. I thought the years ahead would be calmer. In some ways they were, but they brought a different kind of challenge, one I never expected. It was the slow feeling of becoming invisible. My children were grown by then. They had their own families, their own responsibilities. My husband and I finally had quiet evenings together. At first it felt peaceful. We would sit on the porch, drink tea, and talk about old memories. But gradually I noticed something changing inside me. For decades I had been needed every hour of every day: mother, wife, caregiver, organizer, problem solver. My identity was built around serving others. When those daily demands faded, I felt lost. I remember waking up one morning and realizing no one needed me urgently anymore. There were no school lunches to pack, no emergencies to manage, no constant noise in the house. Silence can feel like freedom, but it can also feel like emptiness. That was the first time I faced what I now call an identity crisis. If I was no longer the center of a busy household, who was I? Many people in their 60s experience this quietly. They smile and say they are enjoying retirement, but inside they are searching for purpose. I was no different. I tried filling the space with activities, church groups, community events, volunteering. Some of it helped, some of it felt forced. What I eventually understood was this: purpose cannot be borrowed. It must be chosen. Around that time, I began losing friends. It started slowly. One funeral, then another, then two in the same year. Each loss felt like a chapter of my life closing forever. With every goodbye, I felt the world shrinking. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from outliving people who shared your memories. Younger generations cannot fully understand the stories of your youth. They listen kindly, but they were not there. I would sometimes sit alone and think, there are fewer and fewer people who remember who I used to be. That realization can disturb the mind deeply. It makes you question your place in the present. In my 70s, my body also began reminding me that time was moving forward. My knees hurt, my energy lowered. Tasks that once felt simple required planning. I had to accept help in small ways. Accepting help was harder than I expected. I had spent most of my life giving, being the strong one, being the reliable one. Now I had to let my children carry groceries for me. I had to let them make decisions on my behalf. Sometimes it challenged my pride, but resisting change would have made me bitter. So instead, I practiced acceptance. I told myself that strength at 70 looks different than strength at 40. Then came the greatest shift of that era, losing my husband. After nearly 50 years together, I woke up one day and the man who had shared my life was gone. The house felt unfamiliar without his footsteps. His chair sat empty. His voice no longer filled the rooms. Grief at that age feels heavier because you know time is limited. You know you may not build something like that again. For months I lived in a fog. I kept his belongings exactly where they were. I avoided moving his clothes. It felt like touching them would make the loss permanent. But eventually I realized I was building a museum instead of living a life. One afternoon I sat on his side of the bed. I cried openly. I allowed myself to fully feel what I had been avoiding. And then I did something small but symbolic. I moved his pillow. That moment marked a quiet decision. I would carry his memory, but I would not stop living. My late 70s became a time of rebuilding. I found new routines. I spoke more openly about my feelings. I allowed myself to grieve without shame. I learned to live alone without seeing it as abandonment. Those years taught me that loneliness is not always about being physically alone. It is about feeling disconnected from purpose. So I created new purpose. I began mentoring younger women in my community. I shared stories. I listened more than I spoke. I realized my value was not in doing everything. It was in offering wisdom, and slowly the emptiness softened. The world had not moved without me. It had simply changed, and I had to change with it. Those lessons prepared me for the final decades of my life, because surviving into your 90s and beyond requires more than a healthy body. It requires emotional flexibility, and that flexibility saved me. When I entered my 80s, something changed in the way I experienced time. In your 40s, you plan years ahead. In your 60s, you plan carefully. But in your 80s, you wake up knowing that every year is a gift. You stop assuming there will be endless tomorrows. After my husband passed, the house felt larger than it ever had before. Rooms echoed. Even small sounds seemed louder. At night, the quiet felt heavy, almost physical. Loneliness at 80 is not dramatic. It is subtle. It shows up in simple moments. Pouring 1 cup of tea instead of 2. Setting the table for 1. Watching television without someone beside you to comment on what is happening. There were evenings when I would sit in my chair and feel a deep wave of sadness wash over me. Not panic, not despair, just a deep awareness that most of my life was behind me. That awareness can disturb the mind if you let it. I began thinking about death more openly, not in fear, but in curiosity. I would ask myself, am I ready? And the honest answer at first was, no. I carried small regrets, things I wished I had said more often, trips I postponed, apologies I delayed, old misunderstandings that were never fully resolved. When you're 80, regret feels heavier because time feels shorter. So I made a decision. I would not carry regret into my final decades. I began calling people I hadn't spoken to in years. I apologized where I needed to. I told my children I love them more often than they probably expected. I wrote letters to my grandchildren, not about achievements, but about mistakes and lessons. That process lightened something inside me. Around 85, my body slowed down significantly. My steps became careful. I moved with intention. Doctor visits became regular. Each appointment reminded me that I was living in borrowed time, and strangely, that awareness made me calmer. When you stop pretending you are permanent, you begin appreciating small things more deeply. Sunlight through the window, the sound of birds, a warm cup of soup, a grandchild's laughter. But I will not pretend it was easy every day. There were mornings when I woke up and felt a wave of fear. What if today is the day? What if my heart stops while I am alone? That kind of thought can spiral quickly if you let it. So I trained my mind gently. When fear appeared, I did not fight it. I would say quietly to myself, "Not today. Today I am alive." And I would focus on what I could control, breathing slowly, moving carefully, staying present. Fear loses power when you stop arguing with it. By the time I reached 90, many of my closest friends were gone. Conversations became shorter because there were fewer people left who remembered the early chapters of my life. That loneliness could have consumed me. Instead, I chose connection in new ways. I listened to younger people. I asked them about their struggles. I realized that although the world had changed, emotions had not. Fear, love, insecurity, hope, they are the same in every generation. Understanding that helped me feel less isolated. There is another truth about living into your 90s. Your world becomes smaller physically. You may not travel far, you may not move quickly, but your inner world can remain rich if you allow it. I began reflecting deeply. I thought about the patterns of my life, the times I worried unnecessarily, the times I held anger too long, the times I underestimated my own strength. Living this long teaches you that most of the things we panic about never truly matter. At 92, I stopped fearing death the way I once did. It no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a natural closing of a long book. I do not rush toward it, but I no longer run from it. Mental survival at this age is about acceptance, accepting slower days, accepting fewer plans, accepting that your body will not always cooperate. But acceptance does not mean giving up. Even now I make my bed. I dress properly. I sit upright. I speak clearly. These small acts tell my mind that I am still participating in life, and participation is the key. You do not survive into your hundreds by avoiding fear. You survive by walking beside it without letting it control you. My 80s and early 90s taught me something powerful. Peace is not the absence of endings. It is the willingness to face them calmly, and that calmness carried me into the years beyond. When I turned 95, people started looking at me differently. Before that, I was simply elderly, but after 95, I became something else in their eyes. Rare, almost fragile, almost mythical. They would say, "You're still here," with surprise in their voices as if I had done something extraordinary. But living past 95 is not glamorous. It is quiet. It is slow. And sometimes it is lonely in ways I never imagined. By 95, I had outlived most of my friends. Even some of the younger people I once comforted were gone. Birthdays stopped feeling like celebrations and started feeling like milestones I walked through alone. There is a strange feeling that comes when you realize you have become the oldest person in the room almost everywhere you go. You begin carrying entire generations inside your memory. At family gatherings, I would sit and watch children playing, knowing that I had once been a young one running across the yard. Time feels circular at that age. The past feels closer than yesterday. But with that closeness comes a quiet, emotional weight. Sometimes I would ask myself, why am I still here? It wasn't a question of despair. It was a question of meaning. When you outlive your partner, your siblings, and most of your peers, you must redefine your purpose again. My body had slowed dramatically by then. My steps were small, my hearing weaker, my hands trembled slightly when I held a cup. I depended on others more than I ever had before, and dependence can disturb the mind if pride is still strong. There were moments I felt like a burden, moments when I apologized too often for needing help, moments when I wondered if I was taking up space that belonged to someone younger. Those thoughts can quietly erode your dignity. But I learned something important in those years. Needing help does not reduce your value. In fact, allowing others to care for you gives them a chance to express love. I stopped apologizing for my age. I started thanking people instead. At 97, I began telling my life story more openly, not because I thought it was extraordinary, but because I realized stories are bridges. When younger people sat with me, I did not lecture them. I shared honestly my fears, my mistakes, my heartbreaks, and I noticed something surprising. They listened, not because I was 97, but because vulnerability connects across generations. By the time I crossed 100, birthdays became symbolic. People took photographs. Reporters even asked small questions. They wanted to know my secret. They expected something magical. But there is no magic. There were many mornings, even past 100, when I woke up tired of waking up. Not depressed, just tired. Living that long requires patience with your own limitations. Your world becomes smaller physically. You may not travel far. You may not see clearly. You may not hear every word in a conversation. But your inner world can still expand. I started practicing gratitude in a deeper way. Not the kind that sounds poetic, but the kind that feels grounding. Gratitude for breathing without pain, gratitude for sunlight, gratitude for another conversation. It sounds simple, but simple habits build strong minds. At 102, I lost one of my closest lifelong friends. That loss hit differently. It felt like the final page of a chapter closing forever.